The first rays of dawn painted the sky orange and gold over Ouagadougou as young Kofi Mensah stepped carefully through the marketplace, his canvas bag already heavy with plastic bottles. At 17, he had spent 3 years collecting these discarded containers, but today felt different. Today, each bottle seemed to whisper promises of impossible things. "Brother, are you certain about this madness?" His younger sister, Amma, asked, holding up a clear plastic bottle to catch the morning light. She was only 15, but her engineering intuition often surpassed that of students twice her age. "The elders say we're chasing fantasies. Even Mama thinks we should focus on our studies instead of collecting trash." Kofi paused in his collection, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool morning air. For months, he and his team of young innovators had been working in secret, guided by Dr. Amara Sankara, the brilliant engineer who had returned from her studies abroad with fire in her eyes and revolution in her heart. "Amma, do you remember the stories Papa Mensah used to tell us about our great-grandfather?" Kofi asked, referring to their beloved grandfather who had raised them after their parents died. How he could fix any machine, build anything from scraps, create solutions where others saw only problems. Amma nodded, remembering the old man's weathered hands crafting toys from bottle caps and wire, creating radios from spare parts, building furniture from wood others had discarded. Yes, but that was different. Those were small things, practical things. Was it different? Kofi challenged, his voice growing passionate. Or have we simply forgotten that our ancestors were master innovators? The great mosque of Djenné, the iron-smelting techniques of the Haya people, the mathematical concepts developed in Timbuktu, were these small things? As they spoke, other young collectors joined them in the marketplace. There was Kwame, 19 years old, whose understanding of mechanical engineering was entirely self-taught but rivaled that of university graduates. Beside him walked Safiatu, a young mother whose careful eye could identify the strongest, most suitable bottles from piles of waste. "Dr. Sankara says today is the day," Kwame announced quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Today we show our people that the sky is not reserved for others. Today we prove that African hands can build anything, even wings." The group of young people stood in a circle in the pre-dawn light, bottles clinking softly in their bags. They represented something new in their community, a generation that refused to accept limitations as permanent, that saw potential where their elders saw only problems. "They've told us for decades that our dreams were too big," Kofi continued, his voice gaining strength. "Too audacious, too impossible for this African soil. They laughed when we imagined a future of freedom and innovation. They said Africa could never touch the sky, that we should remain on our knees, waiting for wings to be gifted from elsewhere. But today," he thought to himself, everything would change. By mid-morning, the town square had begun to fill with curious residents. Word had spread mysteriously through the community that something significant was about to happen, though few understood exactly what. Dr. Amara Sankara had spent weeks carefully building anticipation, speaking in hushed tones to community leaders, dropping hints to market vendors, ensuring that when the moment came, she would have an audience worthy of the revelation, old Papa Mensah. Kofi and Amma's grandfather arrived early despite his arthritic knees. At 83, he had lived through colonial rule, independence, coups, and decades of being told that Africa was perpetually behind, perpetually needing help, perpetually incapable of leading the world in anything meaningful. "What are these young ones up to now?" he muttered to his friend Burema, another elder who remembered the days when African kingdoms were centers of learning and innovation. "In my day, we built what we needed with our hands. We didn't dream of flying. We focused on farming, on feeding our families." But even as he spoke, Papa Mensah felt a stirring in his chest, a familiar feeling he hadn't experienced since his youth when everything seemed possible. There was electricity in the air, a sense of anticipation that reminded him of the days before independence, when the whole community would gather to hear speeches about freedom and self-determination. Dr. Sankara appeared at the edge of the square, and conversations gradually quieted. She was a woman of 45 who carried herself with the confidence of someone who had seen the world but chosen to return home. Her education at prestigious European universities could have guaranteed her a comfortable life abroad, but she had felt the pull of her homeland, the call to use her knowledge where it was needed most. "My people," she began, her voice carrying easily across the assembled crowd. "I have lived in the laboratories of Europe and America. I have seen their great machines, their sophisticated factories, their impressive technologies. And do you know what I discovered?" The crowd leaned forward, intrigued despite themselves. "I discovered that innovation is not about expensive equipment or foreign funding. Innovation is about seeing possibilities where others see problems. It is about transformation, not consumption. It is about remembering that intelligence and creativity are not imported commodities. They are indigenous resources that we have possessed all along." Young Fatima, a university student studying engineering, felt her heart rate quicken. She had spent 2 years feeling inferior to her textbooks, which were filled with examples of innovations from other continents, other cultures, other minds. Her professors, well-meaning but limited in their perspective, had unconsciously communicated that real engineering happened elsewhere. "Our ancestors," Dr. Sankara continued, "smelted iron when Europe was still struggling with bronze. They performed complex surgeries when other continents were still bleeding patients with leeches. They built architectural marvels that still inspire wonder today. We are not learning to innovate. We are remembering how to innovate." The crowd was growing larger, and the energy was becoming palpable. Children who had been playing at the edges of the square found themselves drawn to Dr. Sankara's words, even if they didn't fully understand their implications. "Today," Dr. Sankara announced, her voice rising with controlled excitement, "I want to show you something that will change how you think about limitations, about resources, about what is possible when African minds are unleashed upon African challenges." She gestured toward a large tarp that had been positioned behind her, covering what appeared to be a substantial structure. The crowd's attention focused intently on the mysterious shape. "For months, our young people, your children, your neighbors, your future, have been working on a project. They have been collecting materials that others discarded, studying principles that others said were too complex, building something that others claimed was impossible." Kofi, Amma, Kwame, and Safiatu took positions around the edges of the tarp. Their hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the anticipation of revealing months of secret labor, of proving that their vision had been more than youthful fantasy. "With our own hands," Dr. Sankara declared, "with the creativity of our youth, and with materials that others called waste, we have built a machine that flies." The tarp was pulled away with a dramatic flourish, and the crowd gasped collectively. There, gleaming in the morning sunlight, was an aircraft unlike anything they had ever seen. Its fuselage was constructed from hundreds of carefully selected and reinforced plastic bottles, meticulously joined to create a smooth, aerodynamic surface. The wings stretched wide and graceful, their structure visible through the translucent plastic, revealing the sophisticated internal framework that provided strength and stability. "Not with imported steel," Dr. Sankara continued, her voice now carrying across a crowd that had grown to over 1,000 people. "Not with expensive aluminum. Not with materials purchased through foreign debt. No. With what the world rejected, we have constructed wings capable of carrying Africa toward the heavens." The silence that followed was profound and pregnant with possibility. For a long moment, nobody spoke, nobody moved. They simply stared at this impossible thing, this aircraft that challenged everything they had been taught about their capabilities, their resources, their place in the technological hierarchy of nations. Then, slowly, the silence began to break. A child laughed with delight. An elderly woman began to clap. A young man shouted, "Impossible!" But his voice carried wonder rather than disbelief. Professor Diallo, who had traveled from the University of Ouagadougou expecting to witness an embarrassing failure, found himself studying the aircraft with professional fascination. The engineering was sophisticated, the bottle selection had been careful, the joining techniques were innovative. The overall design showed deep understanding of aerodynamic principles. "This violates everything I know about aircraft construction," he whispered to his colleague. Dr. Kone, you cannot build a functioning aircraft from plastic bottles. The weight-to-strength ratios alone should make this impossible. But there it was. Undeniably real, undeniably sophisticated, undeniably African. In the crowd, 12-year-old Geneba clutched her mother's hand tightly, her young mind racing with possibilities she had never before considered. She had always loved mathematics and science, but had been gently discouraged by teachers who suggested that girls might be happier studying literature or social sciences. "Mama," she whispered urgently, "if they can build an airplane from bottles, what else can we build? What else can I build?" Her mother, Adama, looked down at her daughter's bright, questioning eyes and felt something shift deep in her chest. Adama had been raised in a generation that learned to limit their dreams, to be practical, to accept that certain achievements were simply beyond their reach. But looking at that aircraft, listening to Dr. Sankara's words, watching her daughter's face light up with possibility, she realized that limitations were not natural laws. They were learned behaviors. "My daughter," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion, "I think you can build anything you set your mind to." Nearby, 8-year-old Musa tugged on his father's shirt. "Papa, can I learn to fly that airplane?" His father, Ibrahim, was a subsistence farmer who had never traveled more than 50 kilometers from his village. But looking at his son's eager face, then at the bottle aircraft, he felt something he hadn't experienced since his own childhood, the sense that the future was unlimited. "Son," he replied, "I think you can learn to build your own airplane." Dr. Sankara, observing the reactions of the children in the crowd, felt a deep satisfaction. This moment wasn't really about the aircraft itself. It was about changing what young people believed was possible for themselves and their continent. "To all African youth," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the square, "I say this: your intelligence is your weapon, your courage is your shield, your unity is your greatest strength. Do not wait to be authorized to act. Build, elevate yourself, dare!" While the children dreamed of flying, their mothers experienced a different but equally profound transformation. Safiatu, the young woman who had helped collect bottles for the project, found herself surrounded by other mothers who wanted to understand her involvement. "But Safiatu," asked her neighbor Aicha, "how did you know which bottles to choose? How did you learn about building airplanes?" Safiatu smiled, remembering the months of learning that had accompanied the collecting. "Dr. Sankara taught us that every material has properties, has possibilities. She showed us how to test plastic for strength, how to identify the best shapes for aerodynamics, how to think like engineers even without formal training." The revelation was startling for many of the women present. They had spent years collecting bottles, plastic containers, and metal scraps to earn small amounts of money for their families. They had never imagined that this work involved skills that could be applied to sophisticated engineering projects. "We are not just collectors," Safiatu continued, her confidence growing as she spoke. "We are material specialists. We understand the properties of different plastics better than many people with university degrees. We know which containers are strong, which are flexible, which can withstand stress. This knowledge is valuable, more valuable than we ever realized." Aminata, an older woman who had been collecting recyclables for 15 years, began to nod slowly. "I never thought of it that way. I always felt ashamed of my work, like I was reduced to picking through garbage. But you're saying we were actually learning valuable skills?" Dr. Sankara overheard this conversation and approached the group of women. "Sisters, you have been conducting materials research every day of your working lives. You have developed expertise that cannot be taught in classrooms. The difference is that now we recognize this expertise for what it is, and we apply it to building dreams. Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Sankara announced to the crowd, which had now grown to over 2,000 people, "today we do more than speak about possibilities. Today we demonstrate them." Kwame, dressed in a simple flight suit that he had sewn himself, walked slowly toward the aircraft. At 19, he was entirely self-taught in aeronautics, having learned through online videos, library books, and countless hours of experimentation. His hands were steady, but his heart was racing with the knowledge that he was about to attempt something that would either validate months of work and years of dreaming, or demonstrate the folly of believing that African youth could compete with the technological sophistication of other continents. "Are you ready, my brother?" Dr. Sankara asked quietly. Kwame nodded, though his mouth was dry with anticipation. "Dr. Sankara, what if it doesn't work? What if we crash? What if we prove the skeptics right?" Dr. Sankara placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Kwame, what if it works? What if we prove that African innovation can equal or surpass anything the world has seen? What if we demonstrate that our young people are capable of achievements that will inspire generations?" The aircraft's engine, itself a marvel of improvised engineering using recycled automotive parts, roared to life. The sound was different from conventional aircraft engines. Higher pitched and more irregular, but unmistakably powerful. In the crowd, Kofi and Amma held hands tightly, watching their bottles. Their months of collection and preparation prepare to challenge gravity itself. Papa Mensa, their grandfather, found himself praying to ancestors he hadn't spoken to in years, asking them to guide these young hands and protect these young dreams. The aircraft began to move, rolling down the improvised runway that the community had prepared by clearing and leveling a stretch of open ground outside the town. Slowly at first, then with increasing speed, the bottle airplane accelerated. The crowd held its collective breath. Children stopped playing. Adults stopped talking. Even the skeptics found themselves hoping, despite their doubts, that this impossible thing might actually work. Faster and faster the aircraft moved, its plastic wings flexing slightly but maintaining their structural integrity. The engine noise grew louder, more confident. And then, incredibly, miraculously, undeniably, the aircraft lifted into the air. The explosion of joy from the crowd was unlike anything the community had ever experienced. Children screamed with delight. Adults embraced each other and cried. Elderly people raised their hands to the sky in thanksgiving and wonder. "It's flying!" Jeneba shouted, jumping up and down with excitement. "It's actually flying!" Her mother Adama watched in absolute amazement as the bottle aircraft circled gracefully overhead. Its unconventional materials somehow transformed into a machine that defied both gravity and conventional wisdom. From the cockpit of the bottle aircraft, Kwame looked down at his community with eyes that had never seen their homeland from this perspective. The market where they had collected bottles appeared small and orderly from above. The school where he had been told that real innovation happened elsewhere seemed just one building among many. The entire landscape spread out below him like a map of possibilities. "This is Kwame," he radioed down to the crowd gathered around Dr. Sankara's transmission equipment. "I want you to know, the view from up here is spectacular. Our land is beautiful, our community is strong, and the sky belongs to all of us now." His words, broadcast through speakers to the assembled crowd, created another wave of celebration. But more than that, they created a shift in consciousness. For the first time in generations, a voice speaking from the African sky was not that of a foreign pilot or international organization. It was the voice of a young African man, flying in an aircraft built by African hands from African resources. Professor Diallo, who had arrived as a skeptic, found himself frantically taking notes and photographs. As an academic, he understood that he was witnessing something historically significant. This wasn't just a successful flight, it was a paradigm shift that would force the international community to reconsider its assumptions about African technological capability. "The aerodynamics are actually quite sophisticated," he murmured to Dr. Kone. "The bottle construction is ingenious. Lightweight but strong, flexible but stable. This represents genuine innovation, not mere improvisation." Dr. Kone nodded, equally impressed. "What strikes me most is the educational implication. These young people have demonstrated that advanced engineering concepts can be learned and applied without expensive laboratory facilities or imported equipment. They've proven that innovation thrives on creativity and determination rather than funding and infrastructure." News of the successful flight spread with remarkable speed across Africa and beyond. Social media platforms exploded with videos and photographs of the bottle aircraft soaring gracefully through Burkina Faso's skies. Within hours, the story was being discussed in universities, government offices, and innovation centers from Cairo to Cape Town. In Lagos, Nigeria, 17-year-old Chioma watched the flight footage on her mobile phone and immediately began sketching designs for her own recycled material vehicles. "If they can build an airplane from bottles in Burkina Faso," she told her engineering study group, "then we can build electric cars from electronic waste here in Lagos." Her enthusiasm was infectious. Within days, her university's engineering department had approved a research project focused on sustainable transportation using locally sourced recycled materials. Professor Adebayo, the department head, acknowledged that the Burkina Faso project had forced him to reconsider his curriculum. "For years, we've been teaching our students to admire innovation from Silicon Valley, from European research centers, from Japanese laboratories," he reflected. "But this bottle aircraft demonstrates that the most relevant innovation for African challenges may well come from African minds using African resources." In Nairobi, Kenya, a group of university students started collecting electronic waste for their own engineering experiments. In Cape Town, South Africa, young women launched a company focused on transforming ocean plastic into construction materials. In Accra, Ghana, teenagers began developing water purification systems using bottles and locally available materials. Each of these projects explicitly cited the Burkina Faso bottle aircraft as inspiration. The psychological barrier had been broken. If young people in one African country could achieve the seemingly impossible, then young people everywhere on the continent could do the same. The impact extended far beyond Africa itself. In Harlem, New York, Marcus Johnson, an African-American aerospace engineer, watched the flight video with his 8-year-old daughter Zara. For years, he had struggled to explain to her the complex history of Africa, the achievements that had been overlooked or minimized, the innovations that had been forgotten or attributed to others. "Baby girl," he said softly, putting his arm around his daughter as they watched the bottle aircraft circle confidently in the African sky. "This is where your ancestors came from. They were always brilliant. They were always innovative. Now the whole world can see it." Zara stared at the screen in wonder. At school, when her class studied aviation, the focus was always on the Wright brothers, on European pioneers, on American achievements. But here was an aircraft that looked different, sounded different, represented something entirely new. "Daddy, can we build one of those airplanes too?" Marcus smiled, realizing that his daughter was asking exactly the right question. "I think we can build anything we set our minds to, sweetheart. That's what our people have always been able to do." Similar conversations were happening in African diaspora communities worldwide. In London, Paris, Toronto, and Sydney, people of African descent found themselves sharing the flight video with pride and renewed connection to their ancestral continent. The bottle aircraft had become a symbol not just of technological achievement, but of cultural renaissance and identity reclamation. Of course, not everyone was immediately convinced or supportive. International news outlets initially approached the story with skepticism, some dismissing it as a publicity stunt, others questioning the aircraft's safety or practical applications. "It's just a prototype," declared Dr. Heinrich Müller, a German aeronautical expert interviewed on European television. "This doesn't represent serious aerospace development. It's more of an art project than actual engineering." But Dr. Sankara had anticipated such reactions. In her next public appearance, broadcast live to audiences across Africa and streamed online to global viewers, she addressed the critics directly and systematically. "To those who question the seriousness of our achievement," she began, "I invite you to examine the technical specifications. The aircraft has completed multiple successful flights, demonstrating consistent performance and safety parameters that meet or exceed those of many conventional light aircraft." She presented detailed engineering diagrams, stress analysis reports, and performance data that even skeptical international experts found difficult to dismiss. The bottle construction, far from being primitive or unsafe, represented sophisticated understanding of materials science and aerodynamic principles. But more importantly, Dr. Sankara continued, "To those who have profited from our silence, to those who built their prosperity on our resources while telling us we were incapable of innovation, to those who insist that we depend on imported solutions for locally identified problems, here is our response." Her voice gained power and passion as she spoke. We no longer need your approval to innovate. We no longer require your validation to create. We no longer seek your permission to excel. This aircraft represents the beginning of a new relationship between Africa and the world, a relationship based on mutual respect and recognition of our indigenous capabilities. Within months of the successful flight, the Bottle Aircraft project had evolved from symbolic achievement to practical economic model. Kwame and his team established Africa Recycled Innovations, a company that applied the same principles, creative use of waste materials, to manufacture various products for local and regional markets. Their first commercial success was a line of lightweight, durable construction panels made from processed and reinforced plastic bottles. These panels were significantly cheaper than conventional alternatives, locally produced, thus supporting local employment, and environmentally beneficial, reducing waste while meeting construction needs. We're not trying to compete with Boeing or Airbus, Kwame explained to a delegation of investors from across West Africa. We're trying to demonstrate that African communities can solve their own problems using their own resources, creating wealth and employment in the process. The economic impact rippled outward in ways that surprised even the project's initiators. Local bottle collectors like Safiatou found their materials in much higher demand and at significantly better prices. Entrepreneurs started businesses focused on collecting, processing, and distributing various types of recyclable materials. Traditional manufacturers began incorporating recycled inputs into their production processes. Dr. Sankara observed these developments with deep satisfaction. The aircraft was never really about aviation, she reflected. It was about changing how we think about resources, about capabilities, about our relationship with the global economy. The project attracted attention from international development organizations, but the terms of engagement were notably different from traditional aid relationships. Instead of bringing solutions to Africa, these organizations wanted to learn from African innovations and potentially adapt them for application elsewhere. For the first time in my career, noted Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a development economist from the World Bank who visited Ouagadougou to study the project, I'm seeing international interest in transferring technology from Africa to other continents, rather than the reverse. Perhaps nowhere was the impact more profound than in educational institutions across Africa. The Bottle Aircraft had become a standard case study in engineering and science programs, but its influence extended far beyond technical curricula. Teacher Fatoumata, working in a rural school in Mali with limited resources, found that her students were suddenly more engaged with mathematics and physics when she used the aircraft project as a practical example. When I show them how the engineers calculated lift coefficients and weight distributions using bottle specifications, she explained, they understand that these formulas have direct applications to problems they can solve. Students across the continent began proposing their own recycled material projects. In Senegal, secondary school pupils built greenhouse systems using plastic bottles that increased their agricultural yields by over 300%. In Rwanda, students created water filtration systems that served entire villages. In Tanzania, young people developed solar cookers using discarded materials that reduced families' dependence on scarce firewood. The psychological transformation was as important as the practical achievements. A generation of African students was growing up with fundamentally different assumptions about their capabilities, their resources, and their potential contributions to global knowledge and innovation. Dr. Amina Hassan, Dean of Engineering at the University of Cairo, observed these changes with particular interest. We're seeing applications for engineering programs increase by 400% across the continent, she reported. But more significantly, we're seeing students who arrive with project ideas rather than just academic interests. They're not just wanting to study engineering. They're wanting to apply engineering to solve specific problems in their communities. Of the most remarkable developments was how the Bottle Aircraft project catalyzed a broader movement of women into technical fields and leadership roles across Africa. Amma, Kofi's sister, who had helped collect bottles in the early days, enrolled in aeronautical engineering and quickly became one of the top students in her program. Before the Bottle Aircraft, explained Zara, a Somali student pursuing mechanical engineering. My parents wanted me to study something appropriate for girls, maybe teaching or nursing. But when they saw that aircraft flying, built partly by women's hands, they realized that engineering could be appropriate for anyone with the intelligence and determination to excel. Women who had been collecting bottles and other recyclable materials for years suddenly saw their work in an entirely new light. They weren't just earning survival income. They were materials specialists, waste management experts, resource transformation professionals. The African Women Engineers Network, previously a small organization struggling for recognition, experienced explosive growth. Women were not only joining technical fields in unprecedented numbers, but taking leadership roles, starting their own companies and mentoring the next generation of female innovators. Safiatu, the young mother who had collected bottles for the original project, established a women's cooperative focused on materials processing and distribution. Within 2 years, her organization employed over 200 women across Burkina Faso and had expanded into neighboring countries. The bottle aircraft taught us that our daily work had value we never recognized, she explained, to a gathering of women entrepreneurs. We learned that innovation is not about having expensive equipment or foreign training. It's about seeing potential where others see problems, about transforming limitations into opportunities. The success of the bottle aircraft triggered an unexpected cultural renaissance that connected technological achievement with African identity and historical continuity. Musicians across the continent wrote songs celebrating the flying bottles. Poets crafted verses that linked contemporary innovation with ancestral wisdom. Visual artists created works incorporating recycled materials, inspired by the aircraft's aesthetic and philosophy. This project reminded us that innovation is part of our cultural DNA, explained Kofi Asante, a Ghanaian artist whose sculptures used electronic waste to create stunning visual narratives about transformation and possibility. Our ancestors were master metallurgists who produced iron when Europe was struggling with bronze. They were architects who built structures that still inspire wonder. They were mathematicians whose concepts influenced global understanding. We're not discovering new capabilities, we're remembering ancient ones. The bottle aircraft appeared in fashion shows featuring clothing made from recycled materials. It inspired filmmakers to create documentaries and feature films about African innovation and achievement. It became a cultural symbol that appeared on everything from school notebooks to government buildings, from mobile phone cases to children's toys. The cultural impact extended beyond Africa itself. International museums began acquiring African-made recycled material art pieces. Fashion designers worldwide started incorporating African-inspired sustainability techniques into their collections. The aesthetic and philosophy of transforming waste into beauty began influencing global artistic trends. International attitudes toward African innovation began to change in measurable ways. Technology conferences that had previously featured only Western speakers began actively recruiting African innovators. Investment firms that had overlooked the continent started establishing offices in major African cities. Research institutions began forming partnership agreements with African universities and innovation centers. We can no longer ignore what's happening in Africa, admitted James Peterson, a venture capitalist from Silicon Valley, who opened a Lagos office specifically to identify and support African innovations. The most elegant solutions to global problems, sustainability, resource scarcity, affordable technology, are increasingly coming from African minds working with African materials. The bottle aircraft had demonstrated that innovation thrived under constraints, that creativity flourished when resources were limited, that the most practical solutions often emerged from those who couldn't afford elaborate alternatives. Major corporations began establishing research partnerships with African institutions, but the terms were notably different from traditional technology transfer agreements. These were collaborations between recognized equals, not charity projects or resource extraction schemes disguised as development initiatives. The conversation has fundamentally shifted, observed Dr. Chen Wei, a technology transfer specialist who worked with several multinational corporations. Instead of asking, how can we help Africa develop? Companies are now asking, what can we learn from African innovations? It's a complete reversal of traditional assumptions. 5 years after that first historic flight, Janeba, the little girl who had asked her mother if she could become a pilot, was indeed pursuing aviation studies at the newly established West African Institute of Aeronautical Engineering. But she wasn't alone. Across the continent, a generation of young people was growing up with fundamentally different assumptions about limitations, possibilities, and their own potential contributions to human knowledge and achievement. My daughter's generation doesn't see constraints the way we did, reflected her mother, Adama, who had become a community advocate for girls' education in technical fields. When she encounters a problem, her first thought isn't, I need help from outside, or this is too complex for us. Her first thought is, what materials do I have available, and how can I transform them into a solution? The bottle aircraft had become part of African educational folklore, but it remained a practical inspiration rather than merely historical symbol. Students continued studying its design principles in engineering courses. Entrepreneurs continued applying its transformation philosophy in business ventures. Researchers continued developing its core insights in academic and commercial contexts. Most importantly, the project had established a new baseline for what young Africans believed about their capabilities. Instead of dreaming about someday accessing advanced technology developed elsewhere, they dreamed about creating advanced technology that others would want to access. Perhaps the most significant long-term impact was how the project demonstrated and accelerated African unity and collaboration. The expertise, materials, and support for the bottle aircraft had come from across the continent, creating networks and relationships that continued strengthening over time. When we built that first aircraft, reflected Kwame, now running a continent-wide network of innovation hubs and makerspaces, we proved that African problems could be solved through African solutions created by African cooperation. We demonstrated that our combined capabilities far exceed what any single country could achieve alone. Regional integration accelerated as countries realized that collaboration multiplied their innovative potential exponentially. Trade barriers fell for recycled materials and processed waste products. Research collaborations flourished between universities that had previously had minimal contact. Young people began thinking of themselves as African first, national second. The bottle aircraft had become a symbol of what continental unity could accomplish. When Africans worked together, sharing knowledge and resources, supporting each other's innovations and celebrating each other's achievements, they could compete with anyone, anywhere, in any field. Cross-border innovation projects multiplied. Solar energy systems developed in Morocco were adapted for use in Kenya. Water purification techniques pioneered in South Africa were modified for application in Chad. Agricultural innovations created in Ghana were transferred to similar climate zones across the continent. Dr. Amara Sankara, now in her 50s but still energetic and visionary, stood again in the town square where everything had begun. A new generation of bottle aircraft had been developed, more sophisticated, more efficient, but built on the same fundamental principles. Young people from around the world came to Burkina Faso to study the innovation, methodologies that had started with plastic, bottles, and unstoppable determination. The aircraft we built was never really about aviation, she told a gathering, that included many of the original witnesses plus their children, grandchildren, and international visitors. It was about remembering who we are and claiming who we can become. It was about transforming how we see ourselves and how the world sees us. The original bottle aircraft was now displayed in a museum, but functioning copies flew regularly across African skies. They served multiple purposes: inspiration for young people, practical transportation for remote communities, mobile symbols of African capability and achievement. Dr. Sankara often reflected on the chain of events that had transformed a collection of discarded bottles into a continental movement. The key, she believed, was not the technical achievement itself, but the psychological breakthrough it represented. When people see limitations as permanent, they stop trying to overcome them, she explained to a group of international development experts who had come to understand the project's broader implications. But when they see limitations as temporary challenges, they start innovating solutions. Our model aircraft didn't just prove that Africans could build sophisticated technology, it proved that limitations exist primarily in minds, not in reality. Today, when children across Africa look up at the sky, they see more than clouds and birds. They see territory that belongs to them, space that welcomes their dreams, infinity that matches their potential. The model aircraft still flies, but it carries much more than passengers now. It carries proof that Africa can innovate, create, and lead. In classrooms from Alexandria to Cape Town, teachers tell the story of the model aircraft to inspire their students. They explain the engineering principles, demonstrate the mathematical calculations, discuss the materials science involved. But more importantly, they communicate the deeper lesson. You are not limited by your circumstances. You are empowered by your creativity. The economic impact continues expanding. The recycling and transformation industries that emerged from the model aircraft project now employ hundreds of thousands of people across Africa. Innovation centers and makerspaces operate in major cities and rural communities alike. African patents for recycled material technologies are increasingly cited in international research and development projects. Universities worldwide now offer courses on African innovation methodologies, studying how constraint-driven creativity can produce breakthrough solutions. The model aircraft methodology, identifying locally available materials, understanding their properties, combining them innovatively to meet specific needs, has been applied to challenges ranging from affordable housing to renewable energy to water purification. But perhaps most importantly, the psychological transformation continues rippling outward. Each time a young African sees the model aircraft fly, each time they hear the story of its creation, each time they understand that it was built by people just like themselves using materials available in their own communities, another mental barrier dissolves. The revolution that began with plastic bottles and determination continues spreading, inspiring new generations to build their own wings and claim their own piece of the infinite sky. 10 years later, the impact has become immeasurable. The model aircraft is no longer a single innovation, but a symbol of a transformed continent. African technology companies now compete globally, not as imitators, but as originators. African universities host international students eager to learn innovation methodologies that prioritize creativity over capital, ingenuity over infrastructure. Young Janeba, now Dr. Janeba Traoré, leads the African Aerospace Research Institute, developing next-generation aircraft using advanced recycled materials. Her designs have captured international attention, with orders coming from airlines worldwide seeking sustainable aviation solutions. When I was 12 years old, I watched a plastic bottle airplane take flight. She tells audiences at international conferences. Today, I'm designing aircraft that will carry passengers across oceans using materials that others still consider waste. The only thing that changed was our understanding of what was possible. Kofi and Ama, the siblings who collected those first bottles, now run a continental network of innovation centers. Their facilities operate in 37 African countries, each one teaching young people to see opportunity where others see obstacles, solutions where others see problems. Papa Mensah lived long enough to see his great-grandchildren learning aeronautical engineering in schools that didn't exist when he was young. Before he passed at 91, he often said that watching the model aircraft fly was the proudest moment of his long life, not because of the technology, but because of what it proved about the limitless potential of his people. The model aircraft methodology has spread far beyond Africa. In São Paulo, Brazil, favela communities build transportation systems from recycled materials. In Manila, Philippines, coastal communities create flood protection using ocean plastic waste. In Detroit, Michigan, former automotive workers manufacture urban farming systems from industrial scrap. Each of these projects explicitly credits the African model aircraft as inspiration. The psychological breakthrough that occurred in Burkina Faso, the realization that innovation emerges from creativity rather than capital, has become a global movement, international. Development has been revolutionized. Instead of bringing solutions to communities, Development organizations now facilitate communities in creating their own solutions. Instead of importing technology, they support indigenous innovation. Instead of creating dependency, they nurture self-reliance. The bottle aircraft changed everything, reflects Dr. Sarah Mitchell, now heading the World Bank's Indigenous Innovation Initiative. It forced us to acknowledge that the most sustainable solutions emerge from the communities that need them most, using resources those communities control. The environmental impact has been equally transformative. The bottle aircraft demonstrated that waste could become wealth, that environmental challenges could become economic opportunities. Across Africa, waste processing has evolved from survival activity to sophisticated industry. Plastic waste that once clogged rivers now becomes construction materials. Electronic waste that once poisoned soil now powers renewable energy systems. Organic waste that once created health hazards now generates biogas for cooking and lighting, the continent that contributes least to global environmental degradation has become the leader in environmental solutions. African innovations in waste transformation, renewable energy, and sustainable manufacturing are being adopted worldwide. Africa is teaching the world how to live sustainably, observes Dr. James Hansen, the renowned climate scientist. The bottle aircraft was the beginning of a revolution that could save our planet. The bottle aircraft has transcended technology to become cultural phenomenon. Hollywood produces movies about African innovation. Fashion designers create collections inspired by recycled material aesthetics. Musicians worldwide incorporate African innovation themes into their lyrics. But more importantly, the cultural narrative about Africa has fundamentally shifted. Media coverage now highlights breakthrough innovations rather than persistent problems. International students apply to African universities to study cutting-edge technologies. Global corporations establish research centers in African cities to access innovative talent and methodologies. The bottle aircraft proved that narratives can be rewritten, that perceptions can be transformed, that stories of limitation can become stories of liberation. For the individuals involved, the transformations have been profound and lasting. Safiatou, the young mother who collected bottles, now leads a women's cooperative that employs over 5,000 people across West Africa. Her children attend universities she could never have imagined accessing. The bottle aircraft taught me that my daily work had hidden value, she reflects. I learned that innovation isn't about having expensive equipment or foreign training. It's about seeing potential where others see problems. Kwame, the young mechanic who flew the first bottle aircraft, now designs sustainable aviation systems for airlines worldwide. His company, African Sky Innovations, has become one of the continent's most valuable technology firms. That first flight changed my understanding of what was possible, he explains to young entrepreneurs. I realized that limitations exist primarily in our minds, not in our reality. Dr. Sankara, the visionary who orchestrated the entire project, has become a global icon of innovation and transformation. Universities worldwide award her honorary degrees. Governments consult her on innovation policy. Young people everywhere study her methodologies, but she remains focused on the bigger picture. The bottle aircraft was never about proving anything to the outside world. It was about reminding ourselves who we have always been: creators, innovators, builders of impossible things. Today's African children grow up in a completely different psychological environment. They learn science through examples of African innovations. They study mathematics using African engineering projects. They develop creativity through African problem-solving methodologies. When they encounter challenges, their first instinct is not to seek external solutions, but to identify available resources and transform them creatively. When they dream about their futures, they envision themselves as creators rather than consumers, as leaders rather than followers, as innovators rather than imitators. The bottle aircraft established a new baseline for what young Africans believe about their capabilities. Instead of feeling limited by circumstances, they feel empowered by challenges. Instead of seeing constraints as barriers, they see them as creative catalysts. The children who witnessed that first flight are now adults leading industries, governments and institutions across Africa and worldwide. They carry within them the memory of impossible becoming possible, of waste becoming wonder, of limitations becoming launching pads. Their children will grow up in an even more transformed environment, one where African innovation is not remarkable but routine, where African leadership is not surprising but expected, where African solutions to global problems are not exceptions but norms. The psychological revolution initiated by the bottle aircraft compounds with each generation, creating exponential increases in confidence, capability, and contribution. The innovations emerging from Africa continue accelerating and diversifying. Medical researchers develop treatments using indigenous plant compounds and modern biotechnology. Agricultural scientists create drought-resistant crops using traditional breeding methods and contemporary genetics. Energy engineers design power systems that combine ancient knowledge with current technology. Each breakthrough reinforces the core lesson of the bottle aircraft. Innovation emerges when creative minds engage practically with available resources to solve real problems. The most elegant solutions often come from those who cannot afford elaborate alternatives. African innovation centers now export methodologies worldwide. International corporations send their teams to Africa to learn constraint-driven creativity. Universities globally require their students to spend semesters in African innovation programs. The bottle aircraft methodology has become standard curriculum in engineering schools worldwide. Understand your resources, identify your constraints, transform limitations into advantages, create solutions that others consider impossible. Beyond the practical impacts, the bottle aircraft has triggered a philosophical revolution about development, innovation, and human potential. The traditional model, where innovation happens in wealthy centers and diffuses outward to developing peripheries, has been fundamentally challenged. The new model recognizes that innovation emerges everywhere humans encounter challenges and possess the freedom to experiment with solutions. Constraint-driven innovation often produces more elegant, sustainable, and scalable solutions than resource-abundant innovation. This philosophical shift has implications far beyond technology. It affects how we think about education, creativity over consumption, economics, transformation over transaction, and development, indigenous solutions over imported systems. As we conclude this epic story, the bottle aircraft continues flying, not just physically in African skies, but symbolically in human imagination worldwide. It has become proof that limitations are temporary, that innovation is universal, that human creativity knows no boundaries. Every time someone sees a problem and imagines a solution, every time someone transforms waste into wealth, every time someone proves that impossible is just an opinion, the spirit of the bottle aircraft takes flight again. The aircraft that began with plastic bottles and determination has become something far greater. Evidence that human beings can build anything they can imagine, using whatever materials they can find, overcoming whatever obstacles they encounter. The sky was never the limit for Africa or for humanity. It was just the beginning of understanding what becomes possible when creative minds refuse to accept limitations as permanent. When innovative spirits transform constraints into catalysts, when determined communities prove that dreams have wings, the bottle aircraft flies on, carrying with it the hopes, dreams, and unstoppable determination of everyone who has ever looked up at the sky and dared to imagine themselves soaring through it on wings of their own creation. Long live freedom! Long live innovation! Long live the boundless dignity of human creativity! The future belongs to those who dare to build it. The sky belongs to those who dare to claim it. And we are all forever soaring toward tomorrow on wings made from the dreams they said were impossible. The story continues with each new dreamer who picks up discarded materials and sees possibilities, with each young person who refuses to accept that innovation belongs to others, with each community that chooses to build solutions rather than wait for them. The bottle aircraft was just the beginning. The real story is being written by everyone who believes that human creativity knows no limits, that innovation belongs to everyone, and that the sky is wide enough for all our dreams.